Hey everyone, I'm Clive.
And I'm Louis.
And today is episode 3 for the webinar series, the BIM management webinar series. We're going to be talking about how to contract for the right BIM at the right time. And the agenda
is why define a BIM contract?
Why do it in the first place?
Right.
Yep.
And then we'll show how BIM scopes are defined today, usually.
And
go ahead.
and then 5 steps that will simplify your BIM scoping. And finally, how we can deliver a clearer message and a clearer contracting for your teams so you get better results. So the first one, why even define a BIM contract?
That's a really good question. Why should we? Why define
Is it really important?
Must be.
So is this the right BIM? Is this the BIM that you asked for?
Looks like BIM to me.
It's a pretty good BIM.
Yeah.
What do you think? It's like there's walls in there and ceilings, and I think that's BIM, isn't it? BIM.
Yeah.
What about this? Is that
like more BIM?
That looks like more BIM.
Yeah, just a little bit more.
But is that the BIM you needed?
Maybe.
Maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
And how about this?
Definitely
Definitely
the BIM I wanted. So, yeah, three types.
They're different models. There's different amounts of elements. I'm sure there's different amounts of accuracy, different amounts of detail, different amounts of development, different amounts of reliability, different amounts of data, different amounts of documentation, etc. So we face this problem all the time. We have a set of stakeholders on a project, and they each have their own opinion of what BIM should be at certain points in time.
Right. Every one of those people might have a different goal.
Absolutely.
And so they will want to produce something that is more valued for them or their company.
And so Derek, poor Derek, he didn't get what he was looking for. He didn't get what he required.
Right. And sometimes we have owners with this exact same face. Like, what is this? I didn't pay for this.
This isn't what I expected.
Yeah.
A school for ants. Sorry if you don't get the reference. So how do we know what the model that we are either creating or receiving is going to be useful? Well, there are many uses, many model uses, ranging from design through simulation, etc. Let's look at a few examples, 5 examples.
Yeah, and so the first example is design reviews. We're seeing a lot more of AR and VR being introduced into the workflow. So now more than ever,
What is that t-shirt?
Now more than ever, we're being asked to model for this. So as an architect, we now have to know exactly what we're going to do for these design reviews and to make sure we're aligned with the owner.
Yep. And then for quantities and cost estimation. So knowing what we're going to take off from the model, making sure that the concrete is complete, and making sure that we are very certain about the elements needed before we go and try and take off quantities is really important, because missing quantities is going to be a problem for the cost.
Yeah, one of the most common BIM uses is coordination. So whether you're in design or in construction, we're seeing a lot more coordination in the projects, and it's very, very convenient for constructability issues or just finding major issues on site before they get on site. So, or in the model before they get on site. So this is one of the most common BIM uses.
And then phase planning, understanding sequencing and 4D simulations, being able to see it virtually construct over time. Well, what is it that we're going to see virtually construct? Let's make sure that we've got the things that we do want to sequence, and make sure that we've got the phases that we want to understand.
A lot more safety
uses
for that.
And then as-built and handover models, if we'd like to see all of that data and visualize this Internet of Things, we need to have the item or the data coming from somewhere. So we need to plan out what we need, whether that's information requirements from some of these items in the model. So there are so many reasons why we would need to understand exactly who is responsible for what and when, and tie that to one of those uses. So that's why we would really need to contract for it. But how do we do that today?
Yeah,
should we take a look?
Yeah.
So that is one, yeah.
Yes.
Somebody says, this is a BIM project. I want BIM on my project. I've heard about BIM on the internet, and I've read a lot, and I think we need BIM.
Many people start to hear the benefits of BIM, so they say, hey,
there are so many benefits.
Or some people are trying to win a project. Yes, I'm capable. Let's do it. Or I have a BIM guy. Let's do it.
Some people haven't heard of it or don't really understand what BIM is or what it can do for them. And so maybe it's not a requirement on some projects.
Revit.
The third option here is pretty much everything and the kitchen sink. It's quite a comical pun that we laugh and joke about, but the principle of unrealistic expectations is one of the ways as well. And then the fourth one is having clear BIM goals, being able to have smart and really specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals.
Unfortunately.
However, we have the poll results, the survey results, and 1.8% of projects actually requested clear BIM goals. This makes us incredibly sad.
Yes, it does.
So surely there is a better way with some standards.
There is, and don't call me Shirley.
We didn't rehearse that at all. So there have been, over the years, so starting in 2004, being able to define this concept of progression of a model, and LOD became LOD, and then it became LOD. Inside jokes for those in the know. The E202, the consensus docs, the PAS 1192, having information become more important, and LOI, and having accuracy becoming more important, and LOA. All of these different definitions and terms have developed over time, and now we have even more definition and refinement in the ISO standards, and some really, really powerful and clear documentation that is not only also, it's available now, but also is becoming available soon. And you see Martia reference on this diagram is very heavily involved in those newer standards as well, and level of information need, we're excited to start to support as well. But the result of lots of standards and having a confusing time over those period of years, sometimes we're still seeing this type of request where deliverables are required, as that one says, all 3D coordinations to be models to be Revit BIM,
right?
LOD 400. So does everyone on the call understand Revit BIM, LOD 400? Is that something that we can deliver?
Well, these are two line items that are in a contract, and this is, unfortunately, we see this a lot, and
Sadly,
there's so many questions behind this, and unfortunately, this will cause you to either have too much BIM on a project. This means that you are either modeling too much,
overlapping modeling, two people modeling the same things.
Right? You ever have two light fixtures modeled by two different trades?
Or even 5 different trades. It's like ridiculous to think.
And then there's sometimes where the contract didn't define enough BIM.
Or nobody knew who was really responsible for certain items, and we end up with missing them. So why is this such a challenge?
That's a very good question.
Why can we not get this right, or why is it very difficult?
Well, sometimes we just have to start with some basic questions, right? Who, what, where, when, how. These are some of the questions that we just have to answer to get there.
Across many parties, as we saw before. And then it's an incredibly complex challenge. It ranges to actually define many different, here are 6 different aspects that we can talk about. But which elements do we need? How much geometry do we really need? How reliable do we need it to be? What's it tied to? Whether it's tied to a purpose, what information requirements, what level of accuracy do we need for those items?
These are 6 different categories, and yet each one of those categories has a level or some depth.
Has some scale, so imagine potentially.
The amount of
permutations and different, It's a complex challenge. So we've talked about how or why it's important to define a contract, an agreement between teams. We talked about how the BIM scopes generally are defined today. And now, should we talk about the 5 steps that would simplify that workflow?
Yeah. Let's share. So the first thing we want to do on any scope is define the why. So as we mentioned earlier, we want to define the BIM uses. Why are we going
What's the purpose?
Why are we going to use BIM in the first place? You know, if we have a complex design in this building, then we might want MEP coordination to make sure we find enough constructability issues before we get on site. Then, once we define the why, that'll help us answer the what. Now, what scope is required to do the structural estimate? Is it wall foundation, steel? How much depth do we get into the elements?
Do we need reinforcement, for example? Yep.
That leads us to the level of geometry, the information. So here we're looking at, for structural estimation, we might just need some basic modeled lines or basic components. But once we get into MEP coordination, we might need more information or more detailed information.
Yep.
So
some
defining
spaces and blockout zones or hangers and braces.
right, defining when is very important because you don't have to spend that time up front, and you might not have that information up front. So aligning those expectations would prevent a lot of headache.
Yeah, putting things in the model too soon as well, even though it might have a use at some point, if you put it in too soon, it might cause a lot of rework downstream as well. So understanding this progression is really important, and making sure that you model it once rather than multiple times at multiple levels of geometry is usually the least wasteful, most lean approach to it.
Right. And then within each element, there's information needs. There's information requirements, so the level of information, level of geometry, or even documentation items that you might specify for each element.
Yep, and bundling all of that up into a visual, very intuitive grid type approach is really powerful to be able to understand it and communicate it. And here are more information requirements that might be required.
And then one of the most important things is defining who is responsible. So here we're defining the structural teams to model the structural components, and then we might want to show the handovers as well. So having the architect being responsible for the design of the stairs, but ultimately it's the structural team who will be taking over that model for coordination purposes. So the thickness of the stairs, if it's concrete, if it's steel.
If it's precast, if it's cast in situ, is there some kind of requirement for space to be able to install things or to be able to service them, etc.?
Right. So these are the 5 simple steps to build a scope, anything from the why, what, who, and how much. If you can answer these questions, you'll definitely be off to a good start. So a lot of great and successful projects come out with very clear scopes, like the one you're seeing now. And making them visual has been a plus, because if we can avoid what is LOD 200 or LOD 300, and we're just simplifying them into these basic questions, you spend more time having educated conversations, or the right conversations, as opposed to trying to educate others to get on board with the project, or just less time answering questions and more time doing the work.
I've had some really powerful conversations with some senior executives in companies that they've revealed to us that they haven't really understood other scope or really what BIM could do until they visually identify in this grid. And that was such an aha moment, a big bell ringing. It was so incredibly powerful for us to hear that that's been something that we've really focused on developing right the way through a workflow.
Yeah, and another example that I needed to share was an owner would always work with the same contractor, and they've been spending lots of time providing information for almost every component in a model. But when they sat down with them and actually asked them what information is important to some specific elements, they ended up having a 45-minute conversation on the exact scope that they needed, and they started saving hours of time in all of their future projects because they minimized it to 17 parameters, and to, instead of thousands, to only a few dozen equipment that they were really interested in having at the handover anyway. But
suddenly everybody understands the scope, not just of their own, but also of all of the parties that they're working with. It's an incredibly powerful moment. So we've talked about why it's really important to have a contract, and what we have done, and what the 5 steps are that we can use to make that really simple and clear for everybody. What about delivering that? How about making it clearer in the delivery so that everyone understands those contracts?
Yeah, good question. So we don't just want to provide this information, we want to give them access, and we want them to have a say as well. So we don't...
And also find the people. It's not just a company.
Right.
It's really feedback from the individuals, and having them part of that workflow is much more powerful than just sending a PDF on an email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's a lot more information that we can provide our teams as well. So, if there's a certain workflow, a deliverable process that you want to follow within a certain milestone, such as your coordination process, make sure you define a clear flow chart define a clear deliverable process or deliverable dates as to when you expect models to be received, so you can run your clash detection, or when you're going to share those models back. That way they understand how important it is to share those models with you on those days and run those clash detection purposes.
So it's great to have a scope. It's great to have a defined date. But if you don't wrap that in contract terms, if you don't wrap that in supporting documentation to help people understand exactly how and the workflows and processes that are involved, that are mandated or that are recommended, then it's going to be more challenging for you to get what you are looking for. So that's another part. And then understanding that you've got a great and very complete scope, and being able to visualize it and being able to see it is fantastic. But it's really much more powerful if you are not sending the whole scope to every single team on the project, but being able to filter. So one of the really key parts that we've seen powerful benefit from, and actually people are able to read and understand, is here we're filtering for just the plumbing scope, and instead of sending many, many pages of that detail, it boils down to just 3 pages for the plumbing scope. So suddenly, interpreting and understanding is much more powerful.
Yeah, and so one of the most common challenges we found from others is that contracting a BIM execution plan has been difficult. And that's mainly because it contains information of others that people might be afraid to sign on to because there's so much overlap and things like that. But if you can provide a very lean and detailed scope of what they're responsible for, they're more likely to get engaged and actually complete the project with you.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
And then if you're filtering by responsibility, you also might want to filter by the handover of maybe a milestone. So if you have an information delivery milestone, being able to say this team for this responsibility, so here it's a handover scope, again, being able to filter it down and present them just the elements that they are required, along with just the information requirements that they are needing to add to.
Right.
And then as you go through a workflow, being able to keep an archive, but also a live environment for teams to work and collaborate as things change on the project is really essential. So we've seen power from keeping it live and also being able to archive along the way anything contractually.
We first need to know what you're going to use the BIM for.
Yeah.
Right?
Why are we doing BIM in the first place? Let's understand the purpose first.
And not just myself or Clive or you, but everyone involved.
Yeah, so involving the whole team in that process, following those 5 simple steps to answer those basic questions, and keeping it simple. Like and the visual. Whole process, keep it simple, keep it visual.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, huge amount of power in managing it visually as well.